there are 4 to 6 radios set up in a command post, and that was the radio that was connected to any patrols that you might have out, the radio that was connected to the platoons, there was a radio that was connected to the battalion, and there was a radio connected to brigade, and then there was a radio connected to artillery in case you needed artillery really quickly. So the radios, all of a sudden there was a lot of traffic. There was a lot of talking on these radios, and people seemed very upset about something. And I could hear it. You pretty much hear these radios anywhere within the perimeter on this particular night because we weren't worried about keeping the noise down. But things got very busy, and it wasn't right. It didn't feel right. The second thing that happened is being on top of this tall mountain looking down at Quang Tri was literally Quang Tri exploded. They began shelling Quang Tri. A lot of it looked like mortar bursts. I think there must have been some artillery involved. And I say they, I mean North Vietnamese, not us. But there was fire going on everywhere, and none of us could understand this because it was a truce. There was a truce going on. And why would there be fire? Why would there be radio traffic, people yelling on the radio? And it didn't take us too long to figure out that obviously the North Vietnamese had no intention of keeping the truce, that this was a setup for an offensive. And nobody realized how big it was right away, but the following morning when reports started coming in that they were attacking all of the big cities, all of the fire bases, that it was a major offensive by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, we realized that maybe getting stoned was not such a good idea. But it's amazing when your life is at stake, how quickly you can come down. You can get serious and get focused. We were picked up from that mountaintop and flown east towards Hue, city of Hue. Did not enter Hue. That was the Marines' job. But we were assigned as a blocking force outside of Hue. The idea was that the Marines, the North Vietnamese held Hue at the time. The Marines were supposed to sweep in from the southeast and drive them northwest into where we were set up, and we were supposed to catch them in a hammer and anvil, I believe they call it. It's catching between two major fighting forces. Nobody understood or realized how big a force was in Hue. And the modus operandi, the way the North Vietnamese usually worked was to move into an area, take as many casualties, put out as much destruction as you possibly can, and then break off. Well, these guys in Hue didn't break off. They didn't retreat. They didn't break off. They held their ground. As it turned out, interestingly enough, is we were pretty much set up looking into Hue, waiting for forces to come at us out of the city. We got hit from behind by forces that actually were trying to reinforce the North Vietnamese inside Hue. I truly did not think I was going to get out of that battle. There were numerous casualties. We had to turn everything around, and it's not that easy. Simply, it's not as easy as just picking up your weapons and turning around, because a defensive perimeter is set up with firing stakes, directional stakes, with grenade sumps, holes at the bottom of your foxhole that you kick a grenade into if a grenade lands in your hole, earthworks, barriers in front of you. So when you have to turn around, you essentially have to redig that hole. You have to shift it so now you're facing another direction. You reset up your firing stakes, and then you're ready to go. And there's always the concern that, well, what if they actually do decide to retreat? Then they're coming from behind us. We've got people who are coming in front of us. I did not think I was going to survive that. Surprisingly, I did. I didn't even get wounded. It was wondrous. Tet Offensive. I've seen a lot written about it, and historians try to make sense of it. I've never been able to. I understand that at that point the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were trying to put on a big push, not only to recapture areas of Vietnam that they felt were traditionally theirs, but to break the will of the American people to fight the Vietnam War. They knew they weren't going to beat us in battle. Man to man, I think the North Vietnamese were better soldiers than we were. I know I'm going to get a lot of flack on that. But they had been fighting that war since the Japanese, and they were raised for it. They knew the land, they knew they were raised soldiers. We weren't. You know, we were at best we were new professional soldiers. At worst, we were draftees like myself, who were civilians in military clothing. But what we had was resources. We could just keep feeding people in. We could just keep feeding material in. We had all of the technology. They didn't have any helicopters. They didn't have any miniguns. We had much more equipment than they did. We had many more soldiers than they did. And that too is a shaky factor. I'm not quite sure, but I think we had many more soldiers than they did. The point was that the cadre in North Vietnam had pretty much decided that the way to win this war was to break the Americans' will to fight, and not at the soldiering level, but at the support level. It was already, in America, it was already shaky. There was a lot of anti-war movement going on, a lot of complaining about the war, you know, get him out, you know, and end this, and we're murdering people, and that was never a factor up until Tet. There were those in the anti-war movement who basically thought that they were influencing policy. In reality, they weren't really influencing policy, because the government doesn't listen to radicals. The government listens to the voting public, because if they don't, they get voted out of office. And as long as the mainstream America wasn't demonstrating, wasn't fighting for an end to this engagement, it was fairly easy to ignore demonstrations, even big ones in Washington. They were very impressive, but they packed very little punch. Now, when Tet happened, by this point, a lot of Americans had died, and the mainstream of America, who had been able to ignore the war because it wasn't their children, their sons and daughters who went over to fight and die, were able to distance themselves from it. Mostly the primary people who went to Vietnam when I was there were draftees like myself, people who had gone into the military largely because they didn't see a future. The